Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. Going on holiday should not be an event that could take your life. Well, my fiends, today we'll go to Japan in the time of the Ubon holiday, where there were many people who were trying to get to the festivities and relax. People stepped on a 747 in order to get their holiday festivities. Little did they know they would become part of the third worst aviation disaster in history. So, let us go on a journey to Japan and get on that 747 so we can explore our grotesque curiosity. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was a scheduled domestic Japan Airlines passenger flight from Tokyo Haneda Airport to Osaka International Airport, Japan. On August 12, 1985, a Boeing 747 SR operating this route suffered a sudden decompression 12 minutes into the flight and crashed in the area of Mount Takamagahara, Uneo, Gunma Prefecture, 100 kilometers or 62 miles from Tokyo. The crash site was Osukata Range, near Mount Osukata. The flight was around the Ubon holiday period in Japan, when many Japanese people make their yearly trips to their hometowns or resorts. The aircraft landed at Haneda from New Chinto's airport at 4:50 p.m. After more than an hour on the ramp, Flight 123 pushed back from the gate 18 at 6:04 p.m. and took off from the runway 15L at Haneda Airport in Uta, Tokyo, Japan at 6:12 p.m., 12 minutes behind schedule. At about 6:24 p.m., or 12 minutes after takeoff, at near cruising altitude at Sagami Bay, the aircraft underwent rapid decompression, bringing down the ceiling around the rear lavatories, damaging the unpressurized fuselage aft of the plane, unseating the vertical stabilizer, and severing all 4 hydraulic lines. A photograph was taken from the ground confirmed that the vertical stabilizer was missing. The pilots set their transponder to broadcast a distress signal. Afterwards, Captain Takahama contacted Tokyo Area Control Center to declare an emergency and to request return to Haneda Airport, descending the following emergency landing vectors to Oshima. Tokyo Control approved a right-hand turn to heading 090 degrees east back towards Oshima, and the aircraft entered the initial right-hand bank at 40 degrees, several degrees greater than observed previously. Captain Takahama, alarmed, ordered First Officer Sasaki to bank the aircraft back. He is recorded to have said, "Don't bank so much." When the aircraft did not respond to the control wheel being turned left, he expressed confusion, after which the flight engineer reported that the hydraulic pressure was dropping. The captain repeated the order to reduce the bank as the autopilot had disengaged. He then ordered the first officer to bank it back, then ordered him to pull up. All of these maneuvers produced no response. It was at this point that the pilots realized that the aircraft had become uncontrollable, and Captain Takahama ordered the co-pilot to descend from 6:27 p.m. to 6:34 p.m. Due to the apparent loss of control, the aircraft did not follow Tokyo Control's directions and only turned the flight far enough to fly a northwesterly course. Seeing that the aircraft was flying away from Haneda, Tokyo Control contacted the aircraft again. After confirming that the pilots were declaring an emergency, the controller requested as to the nature of the emergency. At this point, hypoxia appears to have begun setting in, as the pilots did not respond. Also, the captain and the co-pilot asked the flight engineer repeatedly if the hydraulic pressure was lost, seemingly unable to comprehend it. It was recorded that the flight engineer said, "Hydro pressure, all loss?" The co-pilot responded, "All loss?" Captain responded, "No, look." Flight engineer exclaimed, "All loss." Co-pilot, "All loss?" Flight engineer, "Yes." Tokyo Control then contacted the aircraft again and repeated the direction to descend and to turn at 90 degrees heading to Oshima. Only did the captain report that the aircraft had become uncontrollable. Tokyo Controller, Japan Air 124 heading 090 radar vector to Oshima. Japan Airlines 123, captain speaking, but now uncontrol. Tokyo Control Tower responded, "Uncontrol. Roger, understood." Heading over the Izu Peninsula at 6:26 p.m., the aircraft turned away from the Pacific Ocean and back towards the shore. At 6:31 p.m., Tokyo Control asked the crew if they could descend, and Captain Takahama replied that they were now descending, and stated that the aircraft's altitude was 24,000 feet, after the Tokyo Control requested their altitude. Captain Takahama also declined Tokyo Control's suggestion to divert to Nagoya Airport, 72 nautical miles, or 133 kilometers away, instead preferring to land at Haneda. which had the facilities to handle the 747. However, the flight data recorder shows that the flight did not descend, but was instead rising and falling uncontrollably. Hydraulic fluid completely drained away from the rupture. With the total loss of the hydraulic control and non-functional control surfaces, the aircraft began up and down oscillations in fungoid cycles, lasting about 90 seconds each, during which the aircraft's airspeed decreased as it climbed and then increased as it fell. The rise in airspeed increased the lift over the wings, which resulted in the aircraft climbing and slowing down, then descending and gaining speed again. The loss of the vertical stabilizer and the rudder removed the only means to dampen yaw, and the aircraft lost virtually all meaningful yaw stability. Almost immediately after the separation of the stabilizer, the aircraft began to exhibit a Dutch roll, which is when the aircraft simultaneously yawing right and banking right before yawing back left and banking left. At some points during the flight, the banking motion became very profound, and with the banks in large arcs of approximately 50 degrees back and forth in cycles of 12 seconds. That sounds very uncomfortable. Despite the complete loss of controls, the pilots continued to turn the control wheel, pull on the control column, and continue the rudder pedals until the moment of crash. The pilots also began efforts to establish control using differential engine thrust as the aircraft slowly wandered back towards Haneda. Their efforts were a limited success. The unpressurized aircraft rose and fell in an altitude range of 20,000 to 24,000 feet, 6,100 to 7,300 meters, for 18 minutes, from the moment of decompression up until approximately 6:40 p.m., with the pilots seemingly unable to figure out how to descend without flight controls. This is possibly due to the effect of hypoxia. At such altitudes, as the pilots seemed to have had difficulty comprehending their situation, as the aircraft pitched and rolled uncontrollably. It is also possible that the pilots were focused on the cause of the explosion they heard, and the subsequent difficulty in controlling the jet. The flight engineer did say that they could put on their oxygen masks. However, none of the pilots put on their oxygen masks, even though the captain simply replied yes to both suggestions by the flight engineer to do so. The accident report indicates the captain's disregard of the suggestion is one of the several features regarded as hypoxia related in the CVR recording. Their voices can be heard relatively clearly on the cockpit area microphone for the entire duration up until the crash, indicating that they did not put on their oxygen mask at any point during the flight. 6:34 p.m. to 6:48 p.m. Shortly before 6:34 p.m., Japan Air Tokyo attempted to call the flight via the selective calling system multiple times. At 6:35, the flight responded with the flight engineer handling communications to the company. The company stated that they had been monitoring the emergency, and the flight engineer, having been notified by a flight attendant that the R5 masks had stopped working, replied that they believed that the R5 door was broken, that they were making an emergency descent, and to continue monitoring them. Eventually, the pilots were able to achieve limited control of the aircraft by adjusting engine thrust, and in doing so, they were able to dampen the fugoid cycle and somewhat stabilize their altitude. Suppressing the Dutch roll was another matter, as the engines cannot respond quickly enough to counter the Dutch roll. According to the accident report, suppressing of Dutch roll mode by use of differential thrust between the right and left engines is estimated practically impossible for a pilot. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the landing gear was lowered in an attempt to dampen the fugoid cycles and the Dutch rolls further, and to attempt to decrease the aircraft's airspeed to descend. This was somewhat successful, as the fugoid cycles were dampened almost completely, and the Dutch roll was dampened significantly, but lowering the gear also decreased the directional control the pilots were getting by applying power to one side of the aircraft, and the aircrew's ability to control the aircraft deteriorated. Shortly after lowering the gear, the flight engineer asked if the speed brakes could be used. "Shall we use the speed brakes?" he said, but the pilot did not acknowledge this request. The aircraft began a right-hand descent at 6:45 p.m. over Osuki due to a thrust imbalance created from having power setting on engine 1, the leftmost engine. The aircraft also began descending from 22,400 feet, 6,800 meters, to 17,000 feet, or 5,200 meters, as the pilot had reduced engine thrust to near idle from 6:43 to 6:48 p.m. Upon descending to 13,500 feet at 6:45 p.m., the pilots again reported uncontrollable aircraft. At this time, the aircraft began to turn slowly to the left while continuing to descend. The thicker air allowed the pilots more oxygen, and their hypoxia appeared to have stabilized somewhat as they were communicating more frequently. The pilots also appeared to have understood how grave the situation had become, with Captain Takahama exclaiming, "This may be hopeless." At 6:47 p.m., the pilots recognized that they were beginning to turn towards the mountain, and despite efforts by the crew to get the aircraft to continue to turn right, it instead turned left, flying directly towards the mountainous terrain on a westerly heading. At about 6:47 p.m., a photographer on the ground captured a photograph of the aircraft, which showed the vertical stabilizer was missing. From 6:48 p.m. to 6:55 p.m., as the aircraft continued west, it descended below 7,000 feet and was getting dangerously close to the mountains. The lower altitude and thicker air caused the cabin altitude alert to turn itself off at a couple of points at this time, before resuming for the rest of the flight. The captain briefly ordered maximum engine power to attempt to get the aircraft to climb to avoid the mountains. And engine power was added abruptly at 6:48 p.m., before being reduced back to a near idle. Then, at 6:45 p.m., it was ordered to be raised again. This greatly excited the phugoid motion, and the aircraft pitched up, before pitching back down after power was reduced. When power was added again, the aircraft rapidly pitched up to 40 degrees at 6:49 p.m., briefly stalling at 8,000 feet. The captain immediately ordered maximum power at 6:45 p.m. As a stick shaker sounded, the captain is reported to have said, "Ah, no good. Stall. Max power, max power, max power." The aircraft's airspeed increased as it was brought into an unsteady climb. Possibly as a measure to prevent reoccurrence of stalling due to the lower airspeed caused by the drag of the landing gear, the crew quickly discussed lowering the flaps. Without hydraulics, the captain expressed that this wouldn't work, but the flight engineer pointed out that this could be done via an alternate electrical system. At 6:51 p.m., the captain lowered the flaps 5 unit as an additional attempt to exert power over the stricken jet. During the period from 6:45 to 6:52, Japan Air Tokyo attempted to call the aircraft via a selective calling radio system. During the entire 3-minute period, the SEL-CAL alarm continued to ring according to the CPR recordings, the pilots most likely ignoring it due to the difficulty they were experiencing at the time. The aircraft reached 13,000 feet, or 4,000 meters, at 6:53 p.m., at which point the captain reported an uncontrollable aircraft for the 3rd time. Shortly afterward, the controller asked the crew to switch their radio frequency of 119.7 to talk to the Tokyo approach. Tokyo controllers exclaimed, "Japan Air 123, switch frequency to 119.7 please." And while the pilots did not acknowledge the request over the radio, they did as instructed. The captain said, "Yes, yes, 119.7. Co-pilot, yes, number 2. Captain, 119.7. Co-pilot, yes. Flight engineer, shall we try? The co-pilot also concurred, yes. Tokyo approach then contacted the flight via the SEL-CAL system, briefly activating the SEL-CAL alarm again until the flight engineer responded to Tokyo's request. At this point, the captain asked the flight engineer to request their position. Captain, request position. Flight engineer, request position. At 6:54 p.m., this was reported to the flight as 45 miles, 83 kilometers northwest of Haneda. At 6:55 p.m., the captain requested flap extension, and the co-pilot called out a flap extension of 10 units. While the flaps were already being extended from 5 units at 6:54, this began to cause the aircraft to begin to bank to the right, possibly due to the imbalance in the lift between the left and right flaps. Power was increased at the same time. However, a differential thrust setting caused the engine power on the left side to be slightly higher than the right side. This contributed to a further increasing bank angle to the right. 1 minute later, the flaps were extended to 25 units, which caused the aircraft to bank dramatically to the right beyond 60 degrees, and the nose began to drop. Captain Takahama immediately ordered the flaps to be retracted. "Hey, halt the flaps," he said, and power was added abruptly, but still with the engine power higher on the left versus the right engines. The captain was heard on the cockpit voice recorder desperately requesting for the flaps to be retracted, and for more power to be applied to the last-ditch effort to raise the nose. Captain, power. Flaps stop crowding together. Co-pilot, flap up, flap up, flap up, flap up. Captain, flap up. Power, power, flap. Flight engineer, it is up. Captain, raise the nose. Raise the nose! Power! The aircraft continued to enter an unrecoverable right-hand descent into the mountains as the engines were pushed to full power, during which the ground proximity warning system sounded, and the captain knew it was too late to recover. Captain, we can do nothing now. In the final moments, as the airspeed exceeded 340 knots, or 390 miles per hour, the pitch altitude leveled out and the aircraft ceased descending, with the aircraft and passengers and crew being subjected to 3 Gs of upward vertical acceleration. At 6:56 11:06 p.m. It was the time of the impact. However, the aircraft was still at a 40-degree right-hand bank when the rightmost number 4 engine impacted onto the trees at the top of the ridge, which can be heard on the CVR recording. The backward shock of the impact, measuring 0.14 Gs, in addition to losing the thrust of the 4th engine, caused the aircraft to bank sharply to the right and the nose to drop again. The aircraft continued on its trajectory for 3 seconds, upon which the right wing clipped another ridge called a U-shaped ditch. The impact is speculated to have separated the remainder of the weakened tail from the airframe, as well as the remaining 3 engines, which were dispersed 500 to 700 meters ahead, after which the aircraft flipped on its back, impacting upon and exploding upon another ridge 570 meters near Mount Takamagahara. Out of the 524 people on board, only 4 survived. At the time, there was a delayed rescue operation. United States Air Force navigator stationed at Yokota Air Base published an account in 1995 that stated that the U.S. military had monitored the distress calls and prepared a search and rescue operation, but the rescue operation was aborted at the call of the Japanese authorities. They didn't want help from the U.S. Air Force. A U.S. Air Force C-130 crew was the first to spot the crash site 20 minutes after impact, while it was still daylight, but they were told to stand down. I guess it became a political issue. A GSDF helicopter later spotted the wreck after nightfall. Poor visibility and the difficult mountainous terrain prevented it from landing at the site. The pilot reported from the air that there were no signs of survivors. Based on this report, JSDF personnel on the ground did not set out to the site of the night of the crash. Instead, they were dispatched to spend the night at a makeshift village, erecting tents, constructing helicopter landing ramps, and engaging in other preparations. 63 kilometers from the crash site. Rescue teams set out for the site the following morning. Medical staff later found bodies with injuries that suggested people had survived the crash, only to die from shock, exposure overnight in the mountains, or from injuries that, if tended to earlier, would not have been fatal. One doctor said, "If the discovery had come 10 hours earlier, we could have found more survivors." One of the 4 survivors, off-duty Japan Airlines flight pursuer Yumi Ochiai, recounted from her hospital bed that she recalled the bright lights and the sounds of helicopter rotors shortly after she awoke amid the wreckage, and while she could hear screaming and moaning from the other survivors, these sounds gradually died away in the night. Well, that was truly a grotesque tale. And it's the number 3 worst airplane crash in history as far as fatalities. I think that there could have been more survivors had it not been a political issue. For those 4 people who did survive, I bet it was traumatizing, since they were just trying to go on holiday and didn't expect the plane they were on to have any difficulties. It was just a tragic event in aviation history. May their souls rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We will meet again in the darkness of the night.